Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh hums with fluorescent lights casting green shadows across linoleum floors, the smell of antiseptic masking everything human. Katie Rodriguez moves through the cardiac unit like a ghost at 8 months in, her scrubs perfectly pressed, her dark hair pulled back tight, a single dog tag on a broken chain tucked beneath her collar that she touches whenever she pauses at a patient chart. The other nurses don't know her well. She takes her breaks alone, never joins happy hours, answers personal questions with practiced deflection. But they notice small things, the way she splints a forearm fracture with 3 efficient movements, how she can estimate blood loss by sight, the tremor in her hands that disappears the moment an alarm sounds. It's 6:36 a.m. when Katie refills the saline bags for the morning rounds, her movements economical, practiced, carrying the weight of muscle memory she's spent 14 months trying to bury. The bag hangs from the four-pole with a soft click. Her hand shakes slightly as she adjusts the drip rate. Always this tremor in the quiet moments, in the spaces between crises. But the moment a monitor beeps, the shake vanishes. It's information. Pain is data. Tremor is signal. Most nurses don't understand that language. She's reviewing medication orders at 7:15 a.m. when the ER doors bang open and paramedics rush in. A Navy captain in severe respiratory distress, his uniform jacket draped over the gurney rail, his name tag reading Chen. Katie's pen stops mid-signature. She knows that name. She knows that face down to the scar on his left temple from shrapnel in Fallujah, the way he favors his right shoulder where a bullet went through clean. Captain Marcus Chen commanded her son's unit in Helmand Province. Her son is a lieutenant now, still in theater, still breathing the dust she breathed for 12 years before the operation that erased her, before Operation Ghostline was buried and 14 months of her service record disappeared like she was supposed to. She doesn't move. The pen stays in her hand. Her jaw clamps tight. Severe hypoxia. O2 sat dropping, one paramedic shouts. Started at 94, now 78 and falling. Bilateral basilar crackles, possible pneumonia or acute respiratory distress. Katie sets the pen down. Slowly. Her hand is steady now. Watch the hand. The hand tells you everything. She moves toward the patient bay with the other nurses, her posture neutral, her face a blank slate that gives nothing away. This is the composure she's perfected over 14 months, the art of disappearing in plain sight. Dr. Richard Caldwell, Chief of Medicine, strides into the unit with his entourage of residents, his silver hair perfectly styled, his white coat pressed with military precision of its own kind. His presence makes the air pressure change. He's the type of man who takes up space without apologizing, who inherited his authority from a grandfather's fortune and a father's political connections, whose name appears on plaques in the hospital lobby because his family donated $3.2 million to the cardiac wing. He glances at the patient chart, then catches Katie staring at Captain Chen's medical file with an intensity that makes his eyes narrow. Katie doesn't look away fast enough. She's been studying the file for 40 seconds, maybe longer, her eyes tracking vital signs, medical history, the classified security clearances that shouldn't be visible to civilian hospital staff. But they are. They always are, somewhere in the details, for anyone trained to read them. Nurse, Caldwell says. Not her name. Never her name. It's 7:19 a.m. and he's already using the tone that makes other nurses shuffle away from his path. Step back. Katie steps back. One measured breath. Her hands at her sides. Captain Chen is sedated within minutes, the respirator hissing its mechanical rhythm, tubes running down his throat, monitors beeping the rhythm of a failing body. Katie watches from the corner of the unit while Caldwell orchestrates the admission with the precision of a conductor, ordering tests, barking instructions at residents who jump at his voice. But something's wrong with the captain's sedation. His eyes move beneath closed lids, his fingers twitch, and under the weight of medication that should keep him unconscious, his mouth moves. Sanjin Valley, he mumbles. Charlie position. Enemy contact at grid reference. Katie's entire body goes still. Not frozen. Still. There's a difference. Frozen is panic. Still is control. Caldwell's head turns. He's looking at Captain Chen, at the monitors, at the fall line. Then at Katie. His eyes track the line of her gaze, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she's positioned herself 2 steps closer to the captain than protocol requires. A resident fiddles with the sedation drip, adjusting the medication, and the captain goes silent again, his arm going limp, the classified coordinates lock back inside his unconscious brain. That name, Caldwell says. Not a question. An observation. Katie doesn't answer. She reaches for a saline bag and adjusts it with her hands, keeping them visible, keeping them steady. The tremor is back, but only the people trained to see it would notice. Only someone who understands that the quietest tremor is the one that takes everything, the restraint that costs more than any scream. I'm sorry, Doctor. Katie's voice comes out soft, deferential, the way she's practiced. The way Major Katie Rodriguez learned to disappear inside the skin of someone called just a nurse. Caldwell doesn't answer immediately. He's watching her hands move through for adjustment, watching the way she threads the needle without hesitation, the way her fingers position themselves with the kind of precision that doesn't come from hospital training. 1 year of nursing school doesn't teach you how to feel the catheter seat beneath the skin, how to know when the needle has pierced the vein by the resistance alone, how to work with certainty while your pulse hammers in your temples and every instinct screams that you've been seen. The needle goes in. The fall line opens. Katie doesn't flinch. She doesn't blink. She tapes it down with 3 efficient movements and steps back, her eyes forward. How long have you worked here? Caldwell asks. 8 months, Doctor. And before that? Katie's hand touches the dog tag beneath her scrubs. Just for a second. Just long enough to feel the weight of it, the reality of it. Healthcare contract work. Traveling. Nothing relevant to cardiac care. It's close enough to the truth. Healthcare contract work in forward operating bases is still healthcare contract work. The lies of omission are always cleaner than direct ones. Caldwell's eyes narrow. He's sharp, for a man who inherited his position. Not sharp enough, but sharp. He turns to one of his residents, a nervous kid named Marcus Torres who hasn't learned yet that sometimes silence is safer than questions. Get me Rodriguez's file. Employment history, references, education. Full background. Yes, sir, Torres says, already reaching for the computer. Katie continues her work. There's a patient 3 beds down who needs his medications refilled, a monitor strip to analyze, a chart to update with medication times. The hospital doesn't stop for observation. The machine keeps running, and if you want to survive inside it, you move with the machine. You don't resist. You don't draw attention. You disappear so completely that the only thing people remember is the work, never the hands that did it. But Caldwell keeps watching. He watches her move through her rounds with the kind of efficiency that belongs to trauma centers, not a regular cardiac unit. He watches her hand splint a patient's wrist fracture with immobilizing tape, using the kind of wrap technique that prevents compartment syndrome, the kind of knowledge that comes from seeing what happens when you get it wrong, when you're working in a field hospital where there's no specialist to call, where your decision is the difference between keeping a limb and watching it die. He watches. And what she doesn't know is that he's the kind of man who collects information like weapons, who keeps secrets the way other men keep money, who has spent 23 years building a reputation that depends on knowing exactly who he's hiring and what they might know about him. At 8:06 a.m., when Katie's shift should end and the day nurses should be filtering in with coffee and complaints about their commute, Caldwell pulls her aside near the medication dispensary. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting everything in that same sterile green. The file came back, he says. Not a greeting. Caldwell doesn't use greetings with staff he considers subordinate. Very sparse. Very clean. Very convenient. Katie stands with her hands at her sides, her posture perfect, her face neutral. Is there a problem, Doctor? I don't know. Is there? The moment stretches. Neither of them moves. This is the first test, The first move in a game that Katie has been dreading since the moment she saw Captain Chen's face wheeled through the ER doors. This is what happens when the world you were ordered to disappear from decides to find you. "I'm just a nurse," Katie says quietly. "I do my job." Caldwell smiles. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile a wolf makes when it shows its teeth. "We'll see," he says. "We'll see exactly what you are." And that's when the real nightmare begins. The red marker was fresh. Katie saw her name the moment she rounded the corner into the unit, K. Rodriguez, written in block letters beneath the header "Protocol Violations, Written Warning." The marker had bled slightly through the laminated board, bleeding like the thing was infected. 3 nurses passed her without slowing, eyes deliberately fixed forward. One pretended to check her phone. She didn't flinch. She set her bag down in her locker and clocked in, the machine beeping confirmation of her arrival at 6:41 a.m. The shift change bulletin board was located 3 feet from the nursing station where all of them gathered. Gloria, the charge nurse, stood there reading assignments with the other RNs. Katie watched Gloria's jaw tighten when she glanced at the violations board. Gloria looked away. Didn't make eye contact. That was worse than the rest. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer overhead. Katie moved to the break room and made coffee she didn't want, a ritual that let her hands do something while her mind calibrated. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed. Black liquid filled the carafe 1 drop at a time. She could hear the monitors from 3 units away, the steady beep 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 that had become her pulse, the same way breathing became automatic after enough hours awake in the dark. She thought about the file she'd accessed last night. Captain Marcus Chen. Full medical history spanning 5 years, which meant 5 years of classified locations, protected assignments, operational details. She'd needed to understand what Caldwell suspected she understood. Now Caldwell had made that curiosity official. Documented it. That was escalation. That was a man building a case. Morning round started at 7:30. Katie moved into position at the back of the group as Caldwell entered the unit, his white coat crisp as blade edges, his stethoscope draped like a religious medallion across his shoulders. He was tall in the way privilege made some men tall, not because of their bones but because of their certainty that space belonged to them. He did not look at Katie during the first 4 rooms. He did not acknowledge her existence. Then they reached Captain Chen's room. Caldwell stopped. He turned. The residents clustered behind him like students behind a general, and Katie felt the room's attention shift like a thing with weight. Through the window, she could see Captain Chen's wife in the family chair. His teenage daughter stood near the foot of the bed, hand on the railing. Both of them looked up. Nurse Rodriguez. Not a question. A summons. Would you care to explain why you accessed Captain Chen's full medical history at 11 p.m. last night? Files that have nothing to do with his current admission. The silence after was the kind that happens when everyone stops breathing at the same time. Katie moved forward. She kept her voice steady, conversational, the voice of a nurse explaining something routine. I was reviewing his medication allergies, doctor. Standard protocol. Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. His smile never did. It was the smile of a man who already knew exactly what he was going to do and was simply enjoying the before moment. Standard protocol doesn't require browsing 5 years of service records. He raised his voice slightly, making sure the hallway heard him. Unless you're moonlighting as a biographer. The residents laughed. It was the laugh of people who understood their livelihoods depended on agreeing with the man holding the pen that signed their evaluations. It was the laugh of hyenas that only laugh when the dominant animal has made the sound first. Katie took one measured breath. A single tear traced down her cheek, not from fear, but from the pressure of holding everything in place. Rage is information. Grief is data. She wiped her eyes without breaking eye contact, without bending her neck, without giving him the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Captain Chen is still someone's son, doctor. Regardless of what you think I know. The hallway went quiet. Even the monitors seemed to pause their beeping. She saw Captain Chen's daughter turn away from the window. His wife's hand went to her mouth. Caldwell's jaw tightened. She watched the muscle work beneath his skin, watched him understand that she would not crumble the way he'd expected. That she would not apologize. That she would not ask permission to exist. You're reassigned to overnight shifts in the psychiatric wing, effective immediately. His voice had turned cold, stripped of the performance. This was the voice of a man who had moved from toying to executing. We'll discuss your future here after you've had time to recalibrate your understanding of boundaries. He turned and walked out without waiting for her response. The residents flowed after him like water seeking the lowest point. The hallway emptied. And Katie stood alone in Captain Chen's room with his wife and daughter staring at her like they had just watched someone swallow poison. The afternoon break room was where the older nurses congregated. Gloria had been a cardiac RN for 14 years. Patricia had trained Katie during those first 8 months. Jennifer covered the ICU most weekends. They were the ones who'd given Katie the small nods of belonging, the silent acceptance that came from working beside someone without asking too many questions. Katie sat with her sandwich. Turkey on wheat. A bag of pretzels. A bottle of water that cost too much from the vending machine. She unwrapped the sandwich and ate it slowly, each bite the same mechanical motion. The three of them arrived at the break room 5 minutes later. Gloria with her container of pasta salad. Patricia with a yogurt and granola. Jennifer with her thermos of soup. Katie watched them. Did not look away. Did not give them the gift of her uncertainty. They gathered their food without a word and relocated to a table across the room. Not an accident. Not a coincidence. A message delivered in the universal language of professional exile. One glance back from Jennifer, something like pity in it, or maybe just confirmation that they'd made the right choice in leaving. Another whisper passed between Gloria and Patricia. They both looked away quickly. Katie ate her sandwich. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the hospital, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, Captain Chen's sedation notes were being updated. Somewhere in Caldwell's office, her complaint file was growing thicker. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came during evening rounds when Caldwell pulled her aside at the nursing station, made sure the charge nurse could hear him, made sure his words carried into the space where the other nurses worked. I've also restricted your access to the digital record system. You'll submit all chart reviews through your supervising RN. This is for your own good, actually, keeps you from any further misunderstandings about what constitutes appropriate nurse behavior. The words were structured like a gift, like he was protecting her. That was how he did it. That was how he made cruelty sound like concern. Gloria stood 3 feet away. Katie watched her pretend to reorganize the chart rack. Doctor, I need access to update patient care in real time. My patients need current. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before playing detective. Scribbles. Scribbles. The nickname from her first week when she'd been so eager to document details that she'd written medication names on her hand during a busy shift. The name had been gentle once. A joke. A small affection between colleagues. Now it landed like a slap because they both understood that was exactly what he intended. You're lucky you still have a job at all, Caldwell said. Consider this your final warning. He walked away. Gloria still would not meet her eyes. That night, Katie arrived at the psychiatric wing to find her supporting nurses reassigned. No backup from the cardiac unit. No familiar faces in the hallway. The unit was empty in the way night shifts were always empty, skeleton crew, computers powered down, the whole building moving at half speed. She checked the assignment board and found her name next to 12 hours of solo coverage for a wing that hadn't had a serious crisis in 4 months. Designed to break her. She understood that immediately. She understood something else too, something that made her move with the careful precision of someone walking through a minefield. She understood that Caldwell had made a choice. He'd crossed from suspicion into action. He'd stopped hinting and started building. The violations board was public. The reassignment was documented. The access restriction was in the system. He was constructing something. A narrative. A case. A wall between her and Captain Chen that couldn't be crossed without exposing herself completely. And somewhere upstairs, on the third-floor cardiac unit, a man she'd sworn to protect was lying in a hospital bed with oxygen saturation numbers that would start dropping if no one paid attention to them. With sedation notes that mentioned him mumbling in his sleep, fragments of classified operations, details about a place called Helmand Province and extraction points and the kinds of military memories that didn't belong in the dreams of sleeping patients. Katie moved to the psychiatric break room and sat down to wait for the night to unfold. She had 12 hours. She had access to the security feeds that monitored all the other units. She had her hands, which remembered things that Katie the nurse wasn't supposed to know how to do. She pulled out her phone. Check the time, 9:06 p.m. Captain Chen's monitors were visible on the computer screen near the break room door. His O2 sat at 91. Still safe. Still within range. But dropping. That's when she noticed the document on the break room table. Left there deliberately. A formal complaint with Caldwell's signature. Citing unauthorized procedures. Suspicious familiarity with military medical protocols. Concerning behavior that suggests undisclosed prior training. She read it while standing. Her hands remained perfectly steady. The words didn't matter. What mattered was that Caldwell had stopped posturing. He'd moved from stage 2 to stage 3. Strategic. Competent. Building the structure that would bury her. Unless something happened that required her to save a life again. Unless Captain Chen crashed. The reassignment started on a Wednesday morning. Katie walked into Sacred Heart's cardiac unit at 7 a.m. and found her name erased from the schedule. Not reassigned. Erased. 3 nurses, Gloria, Marcus, and Chen's primary daytime RN Sarah, were suddenly needed for critical staffing on other floors. The message was written in hospital policy language, typed on official letterhead, signed by Dr. Caldwell himself. It wasn't a request. It was a calculated dismantling. Katie stood at the nurse's station holding the reassignment memo, her jaw clenching once, then releasing. She didn't ask questions. She didn't protest. She simply filed the paper in her pocket and returned to her rounds. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that came from understanding exactly what was happening. This wasn't incompetence. This was a strategy. This was a man with power deciding to use it. By Friday, Katie found herself working the overnight psychiatric wing shift. Alone. The psychiatric unit operated with skeleton crews at night, 1 RN covering 22 beds, no charge nurse, no support staff on rotating schedules designed to fracture any routine. The unit was quiet in the way that dangerous things are quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a swarm of insects, and the smell of industrial disinfectant hung thick enough to taste. Katie moved through the ward checking vitals on sleeping patients, their monitors beeping in discordant rhythms, each one a lonely metronome. Her computer access disappeared 3 days after the reassignments. A message on her workstation when she logged in, user access restricted. Contact IT for details. She contacted IT. They told her they'd received a memo from Dr. Caldwell requesting that her credentials be downgraded to observation only. No access to patient records. No access to medication databases. No access to anything that mattered. When she asked why, the IT supervisor, a young man who'd been friendly during her first month, wouldn't meet her eyes. "I'm just following the directive, Katie. I'm sorry." The formal complaints came 2 days later, delivered to her by Human Resources in a sterile conference room on the 3rd floor. Katie sat across from a woman named Patricia whose job was clearly to deliver bad news without inflection. Patricia slid a printed document across the laminate table. Dr. Caldwell has filed official complaints regarding unauthorized procedures and suspicious familiarity with combat medicine, Patricia read from another document, as if reading a grocery list. He's requesting a formal investigation into your nursing credentials and your knowledge base. Where did you receive your combat medical training, Ms. Rodriguez? Katie's breath came slow and measured. She didn't blink. I took a wilderness first aid course online in 2018. Dr. Caldwell states you performed a needle decompression on a pneumothorax patient without physician authorization during a critical situation. Captain Chen needed air back in his chest cavity. The resident wasn't moving fast enough. The patient was dying. That's the issue, Ms. Rodriguez. That level of procedural knowledge isn't typical for a standard nursing background. He's concerned about your employment record. Your application shows a 2-year gap in your work history between 2019 and 2021. It says overseas contract work, but there's no detail. Katie's blood went cold, but her face didn't change. It was contract work. Overseas. Dr. Caldwell has asked us to verify that with your previous employers. We'll need names, dates, contact information. Katie's mind moved through the problem like a machine. Her employment from 2019 to 2021 was classified. Operation Ghostline was buried. Her service record had been erased. If Patricia and HR dug deeper, they'd hit walls of redactions and non-disclosure agreements. If they contacted the Department of Defense, they'd get stonewall responses. If they tried to verify the truth would disappear. I understand, Katie said quietly. I'll provide whatever I can. She didn't have to provide anything. She knew what she could legally withhold. She knew the law. She also knew that defending herself meant drawing attention to exactly what she'd been ordered to stay hidden. She was trapped between two impossible choices: let her career dissolve under false allegations, or confirm the truth by refusing to answer and watch HR escalate the inquiry. That night, Gloria found her at the 4 a.m. mark, slipping into the break room for the first time in her psychiatric wing shift. The veteran nurse looked exhausted, her cardigan wrinkled, her scrub stained with coffee. She looked over her shoulder before speaking, voice low. Katie, I don't know what's happening between you and Caldwell, but he's calling in favors everywhere. He went to the state board, tried to get your nursing license flagged for review. When that didn't work, he went to HR and pushed them to pull your entire application. Katie's hand stilled. What did he find? Nothing concrete yet. But he's trying. He's making calls to the credential verification company, asking them to double-check your references. Gloria sat down heavily across from her. Listen to me. Whatever this is, whoever you were before you came here, it doesn't matter. But you can't fight him. He has too many allies. He's got connections with the board of trustees, with the medical director, with 3 other doctors who owe him favors. I've never seen anyone move this fast to destroy someone. Katie looked at her hands. Hands that had held lives together. Hands that had improvised tourniquets from torn uniforms. Hands that had closed wounds with sutures pulled from an aid bag. Hands that had signed away 14 months of their own identity in exchange for erasure and safety. Those hands were quiet now. They were steady. They were useless. He's trying to force me to quit, Katie said. Yes. That's the goal. If you quit, it goes away. If you fight, he has grounds to fire you for insubordination and the complaint record to justify it. Your license could be questioned. Background checks will flag the gap in your employment. You'll never work in medicine again. After Gloria left, Katie sat alone in the break room for 12 minutes. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply sat in the fluorescent hum and understood, with perfect clarity, the architecture of her own destruction. Caldwell was competent. He wasn't making emotional decisions. He was executing a systematic removal, step by step, with institutional backing and legal protection. He'd removed her support staff. He'd isolated her from the cardiac unit. He'd revoked her system access. He'd filed official complaints that would trigger background reviews. He'd activated professional connections that would make sure those reviews went exactly the way he wanted them to. And she couldn't defend herself without exposing the classified portion of her past. She couldn't explain the gap without drawing military investigators into her civilian life. She couldn't fight back without destroying the very anonymity she'd been ordered to maintain. That evening, Katie drove to the cemetery in Raleigh where Marco was buried. The November rain fell in sheets, the kind of rain that seemed to come from the sky itself, not from clouds, just an endless descent of cold water hammering the earth. She parked near Section G, row 14, and walked through the mud with her rain jacket soaked through. The marble was wet and cold when she pressed her forehead against it, her hands on either side of Marco's name like she was holding him up. 3 years. 3 years since the explosion in Kandahar. 3 years since the convoy had been hit and her husband had died 7,000 miles away while she was on assignment, while she was working a classified operation, while she was performing medical miracles for 18 hours straight to keep other soldiers alive. 3 years since she'd come home to an empty apartment and the realization that she'd chosen her mission over being there when it mattered most. I couldn't stay hidden, Amor, she whispered against the marble. Her breath came out in small clouds in the cold November air. I tried. I promised you I'd disappear. I promised I'd be just a nurse, just a regular person, just invisible. But I'm not good at invisible. And now I've failed us both. The rain intensified, and Katie pressed her forehead harder against the stone, as if she could push herself back through time, back to a moment when she'd made a different choice. The mud beneath her boots squelched. The cold stone bit into her skin. The rain drummed against her jacket like a countdown, like a timer running toward something none of them could stop. She stood there for 37 minutes in the darkness, long enough that her teeth chattered, long enough that water pooled in her boots, long enough that the entire world seemed to contract to just this one moment of loss. Then her phone vibrated in her pocket. She ignored it. It vibrated again. And again. By the 7th buzz, she pulled it out with numb fingers. The hospital main line. 7 missed calls in 5 minutes. Then a text from an unknown number, need you at Sacred Heart. Captain Chen crashing. Now. The alarm screamed at 2:38 a.m. Katie heard it from the psychiatric wing, that specific pattern, 3 sharp bursts followed by a continuous wail. The cardiac unit was 2 floors below, but the sound traveled through the ventilation system like a predator's call. She knew that rhythm. She'd heard it in Kandahar, in Sanjin Valley, in the back of a Humvee with a soldier's femoral artery bleeding out into her lap. She was on her feet before her brain caught up. The psychiatric wing was empty at this hour except for a skeleton crew monitoring sedated patients. Katie moved through the corridors with her muscle memory still intact, muscle memory that Dr. Caldwell had spent 3 weeks trying to suppress with reassignments and restrictions. The hospital was a maze, but her body knew the shortcuts. Nurses learned them the first month. Combat medics learned them in ways that made hospitals seem simple. The cardiac unit doors burst open under her hand. The room was controlled chaos. Captain Chen lay on the bed with his chest heaving asymmetrically, that telltale one-sided rise and fall that meant his right lung had collapsed. His lips were blue. His fingertips were blue. The monitor showed a heart rate of 148, climbing. His oxygen saturation read 71% and dropping. A tension pneumothorax, his collapsed lung was compressing his heart, and in minutes, maybe less, his cardiac output would crash to nothing. Dr. Park stood frozen at the crash cart, hands trembling. Park was a first-year resident, the kind of doctor who'd never seen a real code outside of simulation labs. His face was the color of hospital linoleum. I don't know what happened, he's breathing just. The entire night shift had materialized at the glass window. Gloria from the day shift had stayed late for something. 3 nurses from the 11 p.m. rotation stood frozen, watching the monitor numbers climb and fall. This was the kind of moment that separated people who healed from people who froze. Katie moved without thinking. Get me a 14-gauge needle. Now. Park didn't move. He's crashing. I need a needle or he dies in minutes. Move. I've never, Dr. Caldwell said only attendings can authorize. Katie had learned a long time ago that protocol meant nothing when someone was dying in front of you. She had learned this in a forward operating base in Helmand Province, in a sandstorm, with 17 soldiers waiting for a medevac that was still 50 kilometers away. She had learned this holding pressure on a wound while a junior medic panicked. She had learned this by watching people die because someone followed procedure instead of saving lives. She moved past Park like he was furniture. Her locker was in the break room 2 corridors over. Muscle memory took her there. She'd kept the same locker for 8 months, always in the corner, always stocked with things from a life she wasn't supposed to be living. A vacuum-sealed MRE package from her last field deployment. Trauma shears with her call sign engraved on the spine, Valkyrie, the name she'd carried in a life that was supposed to be erased. Bandaging materials that no civilian nurse should own. A copy of a field manual she'd never unpacked. The MRE package was sterile, designed for exactly this. Vacuum-sealed. Impermeable. A perfect occlusive dressing if you knew what you were doing. She ripped it open as she ran back toward Chen's room. "Katie, you can't," Gloria started to say. Katie didn't stop running. The room was a symphony of alarms now. The ventilator was struggling. The cardiac monitor's rhythm was degrading. Chen's color was gray. The hiss of air, there would be a hiss of air escaping from his chest cavity once the pressure released, and that hiss was the sound of him getting a second chance. Park, bag him. Get him oxygen, maximum concentration. Gloria, I need that 14-gauge needle or a number 18. Now. Gloria didn't hesitate. She reached for the crash cart and came back with the needle, already uncapped. Some people understood. Some people saw what was happening and moved. Katie's hands found Chen's chest. Right second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The landmark she'd found 1,000 times on dummy training models and twice on real people in real emergencies. Her fingers palpated the space between his ribs, found the pulse of the intercostal artery to avoid, and positioned the needle. "What are you doing?" Park's voice cracked. "We need to wait for." "He doesn't have time to wait." She drove the needle through his chest wall with one smooth motion. The needle slid through the pleura and then, the distinctive hiss of air under pressure escaping from his collapsed lung. A hiss like a tire deflating, like oxygen molecules rushing out of the space that was crushing his heart. Chen's color changed immediately. His saturation jumped, 71 to 76 to 82 to 88. The monitor rhythm stabilized. His heart rate dropped from 148 to 132 to 118. His chest began rising and falling symmetrically again. Katie applied the improvised occlusive dressing from the MRE package, cut to size, placed over the needle entry point, sealed on 3 sides to prevent air from getting back in but allowing it to escape if pressure built again. It would hold until the thoracic surgeon arrived. The entire night staff was staring through the glass window. They'd seen it. Every person on that floor had watched her bypass Dr. Caldwell's authority, had watched her perform a procedure she wasn't credentialed for, had watched her save Captain Chen's life using equipment and technique that belonged to a different lifetime. The room fell silent except for the ventilator's rhythmic breath. Park was pale. He was crashing and I didn't know how to. You did the right thing getting the crash cart. Next time, don't freeze. Ever. She checked Chen's vital signs one more time. Stable. Breathing better. Oxygenation holding. The thoracic surgeon would want to place a proper chest tube, but he had time now. He had a future now. Katie turned to leave and saw Gloria's expression, not gratitude, but something else. Understanding. Recognition. The look people got when they realized they'd been standing next to something they didn't have a name for. By 7 a.m., Dr. Caldwell had made 6 phone calls from his office. By 7:30, he'd filed an official incident report citing unauthorized procedures performed by unqualified staff. By 8 a.m., he'd reassigned Gloria to pediatrics, transferred the 2 witnesses to orthopedics, and moved the 3rd nurse to the evening shift in a different hospital entirely. He'd called 3 colleagues at other facilities, Durham Medical, Duke, UNC Chapel Hill, and whispered her name with phrases like protocol violation and scope of practice exceeded and unsafe nursing practices. By 9 a.m., Katie was sitting in the administrator's office watching a woman with a clipboard explain that her nursing license was under investigation pending a board inquiry. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't tell them that she'd held more lives in her hands than the hospital had beds. She didn't say that she'd performed exactly the procedure that every trauma protocol textbook recommended for her situation. She didn't mention that 12 minutes later, the thoracic surgeon had told her the needle decompression had been textbook perfect and had absolutely saved Chen's life. She just handed over her badge. It felt heavier than it should have. The morning shift change was happening as she walked out, nurses coming in, day staff arriving with coffee and tired eyes. They parted for her like water moving around a stone. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody spoke. The entire hospital already knew what she'd done and what it had cost her. She got to her car at 9:44 a.m. and sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the steering wheel. The dog tag beneath her shirt felt heavier too. The broken chain had been heavy since her husband died in a convoy ambush, but it had been light enough to hide for 8 months. Light enough that nobody noticed. Light enough that she could pretend to be just another nurse working the overnight shift. Now it felt like it was burning through her skin. She had been ordered to disappear. She had been told to let Major Katie Rodriguez die with the operation in Helmand Province. She had been given a new name, a new identity, a position in a civilian hospital where nobody would look for a classified operative. Witness protection wasn't official, it was something darker, something that existed in the spaces between the Pentagon and the VA, something that required silence and invisibility and the absolute discipline to never, under any circumstances, let anyone know what you could do. She had broken that promise in 30 seconds to save a man she wasn't supposed to know. Her phone rang at 10:17 a.m. She didn't recognize the number. Rodriguez, a voice said, male, military bearing, no preamble. Stand by for transport. You're being recalled. We have assets inbound to your current location. I can't be recalled. I was ordered to disappear. You broke cover. Now we control the narrative before it controls us. You have 3 minutes to be ready for extraction. The sound came first, the unmistakable thud of helicopter rotors cutting through air. Katie's every instinct locked into place. The world had shrunk to 3 minutes and one sound, that rhythmic womp 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 that meant soldiers were coming. But that wasn't the worst part. The womp 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 of the Black Hawk's rotors still shook the hospital windows at 10:17 in the morning when Katie's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Valkyrie. North entrance. Now. She didn't move. Couldn't move. The message meant one of 3 things: extraction, arrest, or the end of everything she'd built in silence for 2 years. Her hands, steady enough to save lives at 2 in the morning, trembled now, not from fear but from the weight of a choice she'd already made the moment she performed that needle decompression. There was no hiding anymore. There was only forward. Dr. Caldwell had spent the last 14 hours in his office making phone calls that grew increasingly desperate. He'd reached out to a contact at the Veterans Affairs Office in Durham, a former colleague who owed him a favor from their residency days at Johns Hopkins. I need you to pull a service record, Caldwell had said, his voice tight. Catherine Rodriguez, honorable discharge, sometime in the last 5 years. The contact called back 40 minutes later. There's no record. Nothing. The name doesn't exist in any VA database. It's like she was never. Caldwell hung up. He called the Pentagon's Medical Personnel Office. Same response. No Catherine Rodriguez. No combat medic with that surname. No nursing credentials tied to active duty. The walls were solid, classified, protected, erased. That was when Caldwell understood this wasn't a protocol violation problem anymore. This was a cover problem. Someone had been buried so completely that finding proof required access he didn't have. So he'd done something worse. He'd called a private investigator in Charlotte who specialized in background verification for medical facilities. "I'll pay $2,500 if you can get me something on a nurse named Rodriguez," Caldwell said. "Employment history, military affiliation, anything." The investigator had called back the next morning. "Doc, this one's weird. Every military record I try to access either doesn't exist or hits a wall marked Operation Classified, Federal Investigation. I've never seen that marker before. Usually means something was buried by the FBI or NSA. Whatever this woman did, somebody very powerful wanted it forgotten." Instead of backing away, Caldwell had escalated. He'd contacted the hospital board and recommended Katie's immediate termination. He'd filed formal complaints citing unauthorized medical procedures, suspicious familiarity with classified combat protocols, and potential threat to patient safety. He'd even called a medical licensing board member he'd golfed with in Pinehurst and suggested that Katie's credentials might not be legitimate, that she might be operating under a false identity. That last call was the one that saved her. The licensing board member, a retired Air Force colonel, had listened to Caldwell's accusations and then made a single phone call to a contact at the Pentagon. By evening, 2 federal investigators were reviewing Caldwell's phone records. By midnight, they had his email trail. 17 calls to military personnel offices. 3 calls to private investigators. 1 recorded conversation where he'd explicitly said, "We need to remove this woman before she becomes a liability, she knows things she shouldn't." The words hung in the air like a confession. Katie didn't know any of this yet when she walked out of Sacred Heart toward the north entrance where the Black Hawk waited on the emergency landing pad, its rotors still turning, its side doors open. She didn't know that her son David was already on that helicopter in a Navy dress uniform, that he'd been flown in from his base in San Diego that morning, that the man standing next to him was a Navy SEAL commander named Mitchell who'd served under her during Helmand Province operations. She only knew that when she saw them, the nurse she'd been pretending to be for 23 months evaporated like morning fog. The moment Katie stepped into view, David moved. He crossed the tarmac with the precise, measured pace of a man in uniform, and when he stood in front of his mother, he straightened his spine and said, "Major Rodriguez." It wasn't a greeting. It was a salute delivered in words. Katie's breath caught. She hadn't heard her rank spoken aloud in almost 2 years. David handed her a folder marked "Classified, Eyes Only." His hands were steady. His voice was steady. Everything about him was military now, and it was because of the woman who'd had to stop being military to keep him safe. Commander Mitchell followed David down from the helicopter, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire parking lot, across the entrance where staff members had paused in doorways, across the emergency bay where technicians had stopped working. Major Katie Rodriguez served with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines in Helmand Province for 3 tours. She earned a Bronze Star for leadership under fire. She earned a Silver Star for tactical improvisation that saved 6 lives in a single operation. She earned another Silver Star for coordinating evacuation of wounded personnel under direct fire. He paused. The silence was absolute. She earned a Purple Heart when an IED detonated 15 meters from her position. She earned another Purple Heart when shrapnel lacerated her right arm during a combat casualty evacuation. And she earned the Navy Cross, the 3rd highest military decoration, for extracting 17 wounded soldiers under continuous fire in San Juan Valley while her own blood soaked through her uniform. Mitchell's eyes locked on every staff member watching. Major Rodriguez didn't violate protocol. Major Rodriguez saved a life the way combat medics save lives. Decisively. Completely. Without hesitation. An FBI agent emerged from the hospital entrance. She was tall, with iron-gray hair and the kind of presence that made security guards straighten their posture. She walked directly toward Dr. Caldwell's office with handcuffs already unclipped from her belt. Caldwell was on the phone with his attorney when she arrived. He saw her face and his own went pale. "Doctor, I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You have the right to remain silent." She read him his rights while her partner documented everything, while nurses watched from the nursing station, while the entire third floor absorbed what was happening. You attempted to forge military service records. You attempted to obstruct a protected operative. You attempted to manipulate federal medical credentials through false reporting. You made documented statements indicating intent to harm a decorated service member. These are federal crimes. When Caldwell was led out through the main corridor in handcuffs, the hallway emptied. Every nurse who had silenced themselves when Katie entered a room. Every resident who had agreed with Caldwell's dismissals. Every technician who had whispered about her during shift changes. They all watched him pass, and they understood what they'd done. They'd been on the wrong side of someone whose name they'd never actually known. Katie clasped the broken dog tag chain around her neck in full view, Marco's tag, the one she'd torn off when Ghostline was buried, unable to wear it because wearing it would have meant carrying a signal that she was military, that she was hidden, that she was running. The chain had been broken ever since, two separate pieces that never quite touched. Now she reconnected them with steady hands while her son watched, while her commanding officer nodded in recognition, while the hospital that had tried to erase her saw exactly what they'd been erasing. The dog tag caught the light. The name was visible now, Rodriguez, Marco, Navy, Chaplain. Not hers. His. The man she'd married 3 weeks before deploying to Afghanistan, the man who died when an ambush turned into a firefight, the man whose last words to her were, "Come home." She'd worn his tag as penance, as promise, as the only way to let him be part of the life she was supposed to live without him. 6 months passed. Dr. Caldwell pled guilty to federal obstruction charges and accepted 18 months in federal prison plus 5 years probation. His medical license was permanently revoked. The story made news from Raleigh to Chapel Hill, former chief of medicine sentenced for targeting Navy hero. Katie didn't attend the sentencing. She was too busy building something. The new VA hospital opened in December, and Katie stood outside its entrance in full Navy dress blues, the dog tag now hanging openly against her uniform, no longer hidden beneath scrubs. The dedication plaque read, Rodriguez Center for Combat Medical Excellence. Inside, she developed a curriculum called Valkyrie Protocol, teaching combat medics the improvisation techniques that kept soldiers alive in the moments when protocol became impossible. She taught the chest seal technique using MRE packaging because that's what had saved Captain Marcus Chen's life. She taught needle decompression at the exact anatomical landmarks because precision under pressure separates survivors from statistics. She taught her students that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns, and that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. When Katie walked into her first classroom of 20 combat medics, David sat in the back row in his Navy dress uniform, watching his mother own the identity she'd been forced to hide. Captain Chen, fully recovered and returned to active duty, waited at the main entrance in dress whites. As Katie passed, he saluted, a formal gesture of respect offered to a superior officer. She returned it without hesitation, and he smiled. "My daughter is applying to nursing school, Major. She said if she's half the nurse you are, she'll save twice as many lives." Katie adjusted the dog tag around her neck, feeling its weight like a promise kept, like Marco's presence finally at rest. Across the street, through a strip mall window, Dr. Caldwell sat behind a folding table with a banner reading Affordable Insurance Solutions, talking to an elderly couple who looked skeptical. He glanced up, saw Katie in uniform, and quickly looked away. She didn't stop walking. That night, a young combat medic approached Katie after class. "Is it true you performed a needle decompression with a resident watching through glass because the doctor tried to stop you?" Katie adjusted her uniform and met his eyes. "I performed it because someone needed it, and because I'd spent 2 years pretending I didn't know how." She walked out into the Carolina sunlight, no longer diminished, no longer hidden, finally whole. The broken dog tag chain was now complete, connected and gleaming, Marco's name visible for the first time since Ghostline was buried. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, you understand why Katie's story matters. If you've ever held a secret that could change everything, you understand why she had to wait until the moment was right. Subscribe to see more stories about the quiet warriors walking among us, the ones who save lives in the dark. Leave a comment and tell us, would you have stayed hidden, or would you have done exactly what Katie did?